Just our first question for you today is what motivated your decision to run for office?
Uh, a series of poor life decisions. Um, I, I honestly, it was never something I saw myself doing. It was never on my radar. Even when I was at Utah State, I just never, this was never something I thought. But my junior year there at USU, I was walking through, well, it wasn't let's see, it may have been the TSC, but I'm pretty sure it was Old Main. And I saw a flyer for an internship back in DC with the congressional offices. And I just kind of saw that, and I went and talked to my wife. I said, hey, maybe let's just try that. Let's give it a try. And so I interviewed and got an internship. I went and worked for Bob Bennett for a while, and then an internship became a job, and then I ended up working for Congressman Bishop, and then in DC for the House Natural Resources Committee. And we wanted to get back home to Cache Valley, and did so, and kind of was still pretty involved. And a few years ago, it's I guess almost been 3 years ago now, Kurt Webb told me he was not going to run again and he was going to hang it up. And I thought, well, if we could use some of that misery and knowledge we gained from working in DC for a few years to better this valley and to be of service to people, we'd give it a try. And so I threw my hat in the ring 2 years ago, and I won my first election, and now we're going for our second. So that's how we got here.
Awesome. The next one, it's a little lighter. Utah is known for its soda shops. What's your go-to drink?
Oh, man. Well, that's a loaded question. You said this one's easier than the other one? I kind of like the old Utah standby. I'll be honest. Apple beer is a big favorite of mine. And, it's all that non-alcoholic apple foam. I don't know. I'd say apple beer is probably my favorite soda. If I had to guess, the other one, it's not really I've never seen it on tap, but at Cal Ranch, they used to sell like a butter pecan soda, which is sort of the most random soda you've probably ever heard of. And it was amazing. So if I had to rank them, that'd be 1 and 2. So
Nice. Yeah, I've never had butter pecan, but I'll have to give it a try sometime.
Yeah, I went in there last week and they didn't have it, but I tried it for the first time 3-4 months ago, and I was like, holy crap, this tastes like pralines and cream. This is amazing.
Nice.
So, anyway.
Cool. How well do you think Utah has done in responding to COVID-19, and what do we need to do in the future?
Yeah, I think we've done actually really well. I'm not saying we've done perfect, but if you look at where, as a state, we stack up against our neighboring states, and especially some of the other states in this country, in terms of unemployment, economic recovery, just general confidence in things, all the key indicators which would tell you we've either done okay or are getting better, we're near the top, if not the top of the list. So to me, in terms of making the best of a worse situation or of a bad situation, I'd say we've probably done just about as good as anybody. Now, in terms of what we could do better, or really what we could do to prepare for the next thing, I think there's a series of things that I'd like to see sort of addressed as we go into another legislative session, if I'm lucky enough to be reelected, or conversations we have as a state moving on. Life is about risk, and I always think that there needs to be balance and reasonableness in all decisions. And I think people were pretty nervous, and understandably so, when this thing first broke, and we used the tools of government that we had to sort of address those. But those tools are not are not a good fit. We've basically taken a crescent wrench rather than having the right size of wrench to this problem. And so I think going forward, we need to look at ways to balance what we call state of emergencies. You know, a state of emergency and the powers directed to the executive branch, to the governor specifically, were designed for things like fires and earthquakes and sort of these short-term hurry and get in there, solve the problem and get people back to life sort of disasters. And we've got now a state of emergency in this state that's gone on for almost 6 months, if not a hair longer. And I just don't think the tools that have been used or available to the government were ever meant to do that. I think we need to go back and look at that. I'd like to see some questions regarding civil liberties, individual freedoms, and a balance against sort of this collective good. I think we all need to make responsible decisions and hopefully take care of our neighbors. That's sort of, I believe, the moral imperative here. But, you know, I've got concerns even up at USU. I haven't seen the final report, so I'd be willing to change my opinion if data made me do so otherwise. But, you know, they locked down students for 4 days on on-campus buildings because there was a spike in COVID numbers in some of the sewer systems. And I think that should cause concern, just as at a general notion of what's the process when you put people under quarantine or house arrest? What is the general balance against individual choice and freedom and public health? I have some concerns that decision was made in the first place. And I think going forward, there needs to just be a very rigorous, clearly noted standard when we respond to what are definitely emergencies. I'm not saying COVID's not something we should take serious, because I absolutely believe that it was and still is. But I think we need to make sure that there's good, rigorous process, that we're not just trampling over some things that I think are fundamental to our system in hopes of solving something before we have all of the good data and all the correct answers. So.
Cool, thank you. What are you doing now, and what will you do in your position to combat climate change?
So, I guess I would preface it in this way. I think I believe the data. I do think that as an overall trend, we're seeing patterns change. I think we've gotten warmer, and I think we're getting drier in certain areas now. But what I don't buy into is a general notion that the sky is falling because things are different. And this is like some sort of, I'm not a doom and gloomer. I'm just not. I'm a glass is half full, and I think that I believe that tomorrow is going to be even better. And so when you say combat climate change, what I would say is, what can we do to improve industries or minimize pollution in a way that is also going to maintain the economic health and prosperity of this country, and improve the health of our environment while also enabling people to go to work and have a life and those types of things. So I support things from a climate change perspective. I support looking at a host of alternative fuels, including cleaner fuels, cleaner ways to use existing fuel sources, but also looking at things like wind, solar, and nuclear energy as alternatives. Because if you want zero emissions, those are some of the systems that are going to get you there quickest. I also believe that we need to be willing to make changes. The climate on this planet has never been static. Now, I recognize that in the last probably 50 years, we've probably seen changes at a pace that we've never seen before. But, you know, at one point in this valley, we had glaciers, and Utah State would have been a couple hundred feet underwater. So this world changes. And so what I would rather see is how do we improve How do we adapt to those? Can we build resiliency in our economies, such as agriculture, by looking at more efficient ways to use water if there's going to be less? Can we look at alternative crops because we know we might be a little warmer? Again, can we incentivize transitions to other fuels because we think it's going to be in the best interest of all of us in the long term? That's the way I think you solve problems. The notion that some of my colleagues have on other sides of this is that we have to fight and we have to fundamentally change our lives, and or we're all going, by the ways of the dinosaur. I don't buy that argument, but I do buy that we can do better, and I think that there are definite specific ways that are going to improve quality of life and minimize our environmental impact.
Awesome. Approximately 75% of the state consists of public lands. How will you address public land usage?
Well, I don't, what do you mean by address public land usage?
I guess, so there's been some concern about how public lands are used for business or whether they should remain in public hands, stuff like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I actually think there are values to having some of those set aside. And, Cache Valley does not meet that threshold, that 75%. And honestly, Cache Valley's my primary concern because that's the area I represent. I think we're closer to like 33 or so. But I see those public lands, federal lands, as a net positive to our community. I think we have to recognize that the history of this valley consists of, in the early 1900s, us petitioning the federal government to acquire some of what were then private inholdings and establish the Cache National Forest. So Theodore Roosevelt did that, I believe, in 1905. My date's probably wrong, but that was based on a petition of this community to do so. Now, I think it was also believed at the time, and I think that we can still be there, that the federal government would be a partner, that they would help manage, and that they'd be a good neighbor, and that it collectively having it under that sort of control would be consistent with what was then the Forest Service mantra, which is, the greatest good for the greatest many for the longest time. And so I think if we can maintain that sort of partnership with the federal government and our federal partners, I think that will be of value to all of us in the long term. I think that includes things like making sure grazing and logging and recreation, whatever use, is done in a way that provides certainty to the user group, but is also economically, ecologically, and socially sustainable for the rest of the communities where it surrounds. So as long as the federal government maintains itself as a partner and doesn't treat the rest of us like it's our landlord, I think that will be a net benefit for all of us, and in the long run is going to provide the greatest dividend. So I actually I look forward to working with folks. I've run bills. If you look, I ran a bill session before last, that established funding mechanism for what was a shared stewardship agreement. So the governor and the Secretary of Agriculture came and basically said, we are going to work together collectively with state and federal resources to improve watershed health, create greater resiliency in the forest as it pertains to fire in local systems, and we're going to have processes to move forward and manage these properties by both the state and the U.S. Forest Service. And I think those types of partnerships are going to be things I continue to champion. I'm proud of that. It was the first agreement in the state. We've already last year we put about $5 million into improving those objectives on federal lands. This year we're going to do at least that much. And I think that's the approach, and that's going to continue to be the approach I take.
Cool. Let's see. Our next question is, what music, podcasts, or audiobooks have you been listening to recently?
So I don't podcast or audiobook because I don't really have time to sit down. And if I do sit down, I'm usually driving. and an audiobook will put me to sleep faster than just about anything. I've been reading a bunch of Bernard. Oh, I'm gonna slam his last name. I think it's not. I think it's DeSoto is how you say his last name. He won the Pulitzer Prize for one of his books about the history of Western expansion. I've been rereading that. Basically, he covered the book's called Way West. It's about the Lewis and Clark expedition, and then sort of going forward. So I like histories, Western histories. I've been reading a lot of that sort of genre. I've been reading Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner, which is sort of a history on the West. And then a lot of people may not know this, but when I'm not in what little free time I have, I'm actually a graduate student up at USU. And I am pursuing a PhD in forestry at the moment. I'm like 4 years in, and we'll see if it ever happens. So I've been reading, obviously a lot of papers in that space relative to fire, forest management, those types of things. And then on the music side, I'm a farm kid. I like country. I'm not ashamed. Now, I don't like necessarily all the new whatever, like, here's my beer, there's my girlfriend stuff. But, the older Chris Ledoux, Ian Tyson, those are kind of my guys. So.
Nice. I like country too, so you're not alone. Cool. Well, I guess this question kind of relates to you. So all these questions came from students.
Yep.
How will you represent Utah's large college student population?
See, so that's a good question, but I very much believe that you've got to be really specific in terms of representation of your district. I think I see it as my job to do and vote the way my constituents would if they had been presented the same information that I'm presented and were forced to make the same decisions that I'm forced to make when I sit there in the Capitol and vote. So my representation of USU is, in terms of on campus and all of that, is almost zero. My district ends at River Heights, basically is as far north as I go. And then it goes from River Heights across the south end to Mendon. And then it's basically everything south of Valley View Highway. And so when I look at my representation of Aggie alum, it's either going to be students that are, commuting to school that live at home, grew up here, live at home, or are commuting a little bit further. It's not going to be, nobody that lives up there by the TSC in the Living Learning Center or whatever they call it now is in my district, but somebody that drives 20 minutes and parks on campus is. So I kind of try and take that perspective on things. But the other thing, is maybe I'm a proud Aggie. My wife's an Aggie. We met at Utah State during homecoming week. They used to do a dance when we went to school there, where they'd have a dance up kind of between the parking garage, just on that main drag through campus, and you'd paint the street, and then you'd throw paint on each other, whatever. That's where I met my wife. And then we both graduated. And so that colors that. I'm proud of Utah State. I'm proud that I went there. My kids better go there if they want to stay in the will. And so that is always going to be a part of who I am. And that's going to be part of how I vote, just based on some of the information I learned and how I learned at Utah State. So.
Awesome. So over the summer, these two topics have been big. So the question is, what plans do you have to address racial justice and police reform issues?
Yeah, so I know it's been a pretty controversial issue, I kind of take a step back a little bit. Now, I think any injustice in the world needs to be prosecuted at the fullest extent of the law. Like, it's to take a view of someone based solely on color or gender or orientation is abhorrent. It's wrong, and it has no place in our society. And that's just fundamentally what I believe. But I'm also a proud supporter of law enforcement. I am. I grew up, my father was a highway patrolman. He did 33 years working for the state. And so I saw through my father that job. And I have maybe a different perspective than some. I see law enforcement as a service. And I see the men and women that wear the blue and wear the badge as people that we should respect, and that we should really be grateful for and proud of as in our society. I just do. Now, I also believe that anyone who violates that trust and is not consistent with the creed they signed up for, and embarrasses or takes away from the respect that's owed to law enforcement generally, should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And so I think 98% of cops are good people doing the right thing for the right reason. And when you get bad actors, I think you throw the book at them and you make an example out of them. So I would be comfortable looking at ways to ensure that we are making sure police have adequate training. I'm making sure that, again, if there's any violation at that level, any corruption, that it's fully prosecuted. But I'm completely against and couldn't be more opposed to initiatives such as defund the police or other systems or initiatives that look at minimizing the funding that is available to those folks that are putting their lives on the line to make us safe.
Cool. If you had to condense your platform into a tweet, what would it be?
And how many characters is a tweet? I don't tweet.
I think it's like 280 now, so pretty short.
Okay. My platform is, I guess, the government that governs least governs best. So that's what I fundamentally believe, and that's sort of my perspective. The government that governs least governs best, just because I think individual choice, individual liberty, individual accountability are the best ways to move our society and as individuals forward. So
cool. And then the last question we have for you today. So you, like you said, you represent the south end of Cache Valley in addition to a few other areas. What are some specific issues you see the south part of Cache Valley facing?
yeah, so I think the south part of the valley is probably growing faster than any other part in Cache Valley right now. So we're going to be facing a lot of issues relative to water, infrastructure development, just everything that sort of comes with growth. And so when I'm down there at the legislature, I'm not only looking out for us, hopefully, and making sure that we have the water and access to funding for roads and all of those things that we need to grow. I'm also trying to be jealous of those resources that we have. So water statewide is a limiting factor to growth. And if you look at, there are a few places other than Cache Valley that have basically been shown that they're going to have enough water, and they probably will get a little bit wetter as time goes forward. So as there are other parts of this state that are kind of eyeballing that, I want to make sure that those resources that originate in this county stay in this county. And so that's something that we work on. The other thing that's sort of important, so while we are growing on the south end, our base industries are still largely tied to agriculture. Now, there's a few exceptions down there with folks like Icon and others that have done really well and are building into new technologies. But in my district, JBS, the beef plant, is one of the largest employers. And you've got dairy processing that goes on in Hiram. That's a large employer providing a commodity that goes all across the country. And there are beef producers and dairymen, hay producers, just agricultural industry writ large that's supplying that commodity to those manufacturing sites. So making sure that agriculture and agricultural resources are maintained and protected is another key part of what I hope to do on the south end. So
Awesome. Thank you again for doing this with us.